church life. So this morning, a tough question. Does science disprove the Bible? Does science disprove the Bible? In 1961, Yuri Gagarin was the first human being to travel into space. You may be old enough, like me, to actually remember that, just about. His Russian spacecraft, Vostok 1, left the Earth's atmosphere and orbited the Earth for about 2 hours. Now, on his return to Earth, Gagarin made the following statement, amongst many others, that he said, "I saw no God, nor angels, whilst I was in orbit." Well, I suppose it was half meant as a joke, but it certainly contained truth, as far as he was concerned, so he thought. The truth was that having gone into space and having advanced scientific exploration so much, that a belief in God and the supernatural world was totally unnecessary to explain life. We've arrived. Science has advanced to such a degree that it disproves the Bible and it undermines the basis of any belief in God or Christianity and so on. I saw no God. Well, contrast that then with the successful landing of the first men on the moon a few years later, 1969, by the Apollo 11 mission. Having followed Neil Armstrong onto the surface of the moon, astronaut Buzz Aldrin took communion on the surface of the moon. Not many people know that, but he did. The cup and the plate used for that communion on the moon is today kept in Webster Presbyterian Church in Texas, where Aldrin was an elder at that time. So why am I mentioning these two events? Well, two more contrasting sort of views of the world and of creation and of scientific exploration and discovery. We couldn't really find more two contrasting views, could we? The first, Gagarin, an expression of an atheistic scientific outlook. The second, an expression of a scientist, but one who's deeply committed still to the Christian faith. So for him there was no conflict. So what is the relationship then between Christianity and science? Is it friend or is it foe? Is it an enemy? Has science disproved the Bible, the existence of God, and therefore the claims of the Christian faith? I mean, some would even say that talking of God is irrelevant today in our scientifically advanced world. Space travel, the internet, cyberspace, communication, and so on. Computers. Has science now got all the answers to life, to the universe, to everything? Well, some scientists these days, especially those known as the new atheists, the more aggressive atheists, they are strong in their opposition to any belief in God. They're on both sides of the Atlantic, in England and the USA and other countries as well, but I suppose for me in the UK and for many people, it's people like Richard Dawkins, Professor Richard Dawkins in Oxford, England. He's written, he's spoken, he's well known as one of the new atheists. And he says that we can now explain all the workings of the universe without the need of a creator at all. Well, let's then just consider for a moment the triumph of science, as we're thinking about the relationship between science and the Bible. Now, I need to make a disclaimer here, of course. You'll know me. I am no scientist. I have no specialist knowledge in science. It would be better in a way if there was someone who was a scientist and a Christian presenting this, but what we will do this morning really is not look in details of either scientific or theological necessarily. We'll just look at some of the big picture, the broad strokes with a brush, some of the big principles as we try and evaluate science and the Bible. The triumph of science. There's no doubting, is there? There's no reason why we should doubt that science has brought an immense amount of understanding and benefit to our world. People estimate that the sum total of human knowledge these days doubles roughly every 3 years. That's an amazing statistic, isn't it? So rapid is our advance now in terms of scientific knowledge. In physics, cosmology, we can now claim to know what happened to our universe as early as a tiny fraction of a second after the Big Bang. That seems astounding, doesn't it? In chemistry, we understand the most complicated reactions amongst atoms and molecules, and in biology we know how the living cell works, and we've mapped out our entire genome and so on. I don't understand all these things. It sounds good, though, doesn't it? But this is what they tell us, the experts. An amazing amount of discovery and progress. Yes, science is amazing. It's a wonderful undertaking. It teaches us about life, the world, the universe, and so on. So, science as a neutral means of discovering the truth about our world should be welcomed by every Christian, of course. And it was St. Augustine who said famously, all truth is God's truth. So we needn't be afraid of scientific truth. That means that if we understand the Bible correctly, and if we understand scientific data correctly, they'll not contradict each other. God is the author of both scriptural truth and scientific truth, natural truth. And every Christian should have great respect for and be thankful for the scientific method. We accept its validity, that is, that you have a hypothesis, a theory, and you then test it against experiments and facts. I think the problem arises on either end of the spectrum, perhaps. There are some well-meaning Christians who seem to take an automatic position that science and the Bible are always at odds, they're enemies. And they go through life with a chip on their shoulders, having to prove that scientists are wrong. Well, this attitude obviously contributes nothing to anybody's understanding. Actually, as Christians, we have to admit that we've been wrong in the past. There's some famous examples, aren't there? When Nicholas Copernicus declared that the earth was not the center of the universe, he was declared a heretic by the church. And then a bit later, as Galileo, he was put on trial, and he was declared a heretic and excommunicated because he said that the sun was the center of our solar system. And church authorities demanded that he retracted that, and he didn't, and so he suffered the consequences. But he was right, and the church at the time was wrong. So clearly science has made astonishing discoveries and has exposed entrenched beliefs that some people thought were taught in the Bible as being false. Every Christian should support the quest of science as it seeks to uncover and understand the amazing mysteries of our universe, and we've nothing to fear from that honest exploration of truth. In fact, many Christian scientists, scientists who are Christians, not Christian scientists, not part of that sect called Christian Scientists, but scientists who are Christians would say that their discovery, their study, just increases their sense of wonder and amazement at God's grandeur, the complexity, the enormity of the universe. Their appreciation of God's glory is just deepened and enriched. But does this vast scientific knowledge and exploration disprove, therefore, the existence of some kind of pre-existent outside force that could have launched all this on its way? Well, clearly the answer is no. And that's where at the other end of the spectrum, the new atheists take really a step of faith. They go beyond the scientific data, and they don't seem to acknowledge that science has its limitations. So let's just consider briefly some of the limitations of science. Science is amazing. It's a wonderful undertaking. There's amazing facts to teach us about the world and the universe and so on, but science has not revealed to us why the universe came into existence, nor what preceded its birth in the Big Bang, if that's what you believe. Biological evolution has not brought us the slightest understanding of how life actually began, of the first living organisms, how that emerged from inanimate matter on the planet. So it has its limitations. And neither is it able to help us with some of the great questions of our existence, the great mysteries of life. How did consciousness arise in living things? Where does thinking and language and self-awareness comes from? What is it that allows human beings to understand the mysteries that they're discovering, the mysteries of biology, physics, mathematics, engineering, medicine, and so on? What is it within us that enables us to create great works of art, music, architecture, literature, that seems to put mankind on a unique footing, really? Science is nowhere near explaining those sorts of mysteries and the big questions about life. And as many scientists of faith would say, science has not been able to explain the incredible facts of the fine-tuning of the universe and of our world and of our planet. Why is our universe so amazingly, precisely tailor-made for the emergence of life, for the sustaining of life? Modern science has shown us that our universe and nature's laws are so very finely tuned that if that tuning were just a little bit off, just a tiny bit, life as we know it would not be able to exist. For example, the gravitational force that's constant throughout the universe, if that was just tweaked just slightly stronger or weaker, we'd have no stars, no water, no life, no blue planet. Now, it's interesting that also in terms of limitations, science, of course, changes in its opinions and in its dogmas. At the beginning of the 20th century, most scientists believed, non-Christian scientists believed, that the universe did not have a beginning. It always has been. But now, according to the literature, over 90% of all scientists would believe that the universe did have a beginning. All of today's evidence shows that the universe is constantly expanding. And if it's expanding, it must have had a beginning. And what is often referred to as the Big Bang. That was the beginning of the expansion. But even then, the rate is so perfectly fine-tuned that if, and I don't understand all these figures, but if at the beginning it was different by just 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, that's a 1 with 60 zeros after it, we would not be here. And that expanding universe continues at that rate all the time, constantly. If it was expanding a tiny bit slower, it would have collapsed long ago. Now, science can observe all this, but it can't really explain the amazing intricacies and the why of why all that happens. It has its limitations. So then, what do we do with the conclusions of science? What do we do with all this mass of data and discovery and the facts of modern scientific research? Well, I suppose the short answer is we accept it. I mean, what else can you do if it's the fact? If all truth is God's truth, and what science discovers is actually true, then there's no point in arguing about it, putting our heads in the sand and arguing about it. Those are the facts. The debate comes, of course, with what do you do with the facts? How do you interpret the facts? What do you think the facts point to? What do they imply? What do they mean? And that's where we would have to differ from a materialistic, a purely secular interpretation of the facts and of our universe. I suppose today, in the Western world anyway, we could say there are basically two views regarding our existence as human beings. It would probably be true to say that the majority of people in Europe, and may not be so much in America, but in Europe today, they would believe there is no God. Now, of course, they would not call themselves atheists. They're not aggressive atheists like that. But no God that really matters to them. There's no God that really matters. They are what we would call practical atheists. For all practical purposes, they don't believe in a God. A God doesn't really come into their thinking or their lives and so on. That's what many would say the conclusions of science lead to. We are on our own in the universe. And that phrase, "we are on our own," is an idea that's powerfully argued for by people like Richard Dawkins in his books like The Blind Watchmaker. Dawkins writes this: "Science has completely eliminated the need for God. We are on our own." In such a view, of course, of science, then it is very much the enemy of the Christian faith. Man is supreme, God is nothing, God is not necessary. There's no need for the non-material, for a supernatural intervention to explain the origin of life, the rise of man, or any other part of the material cosmos. There's no need for it. Dawkins says again, mankind is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. We are on our own. So the question is, are those conclusions of that science, are they the result of reasoned arguments based on scientifically proved facts? Or are they the result of a thinking that's based on certain presuppositions about life and about the universe, which actually, if they're analysed, they're as much a statement of faith, a system of belief, as a Christian worldview is? A Christian response to that would be to say, yes, they are. That's going beyond the facts of science. And the Christian response to those sort of statements of Dawkins and others is to say, no, we are not alone. We're not alone in the universe. And we say so, not just because the Bible tells us, but because of the conclusions of science point that way too. We're not being obscurantist. We're not ignoring things. In fact, science itself is not the enemy of the Christian faith or the Bible. If you look at history, certainly in the European world, there's a very strong case for arguing that the flowering of modern scientific research and exploration and progress is built on a Judeo-Christian worldview. That's what it gave birth to. It's a biblical worldview. It's a worldview which rejects the notion of a modern, the aggressive atheist that this world is just the product of the blind and chaotic forces of chance. No. The biblical worldview says it's the result of a work of a divine order and a marvelous design in which our laws are constant. And that's why experiments are repeatable and progress can be made. Hypotheses, theories can be tested because there's a consistency to the laws that govern the natural world, because there's a consistency behind them, because there is a creator God. Sir Isaac Newton, the 17th century genius, really, scientific, a Christian genius, Trinity College, Cambridge, is recognized still as one of the most influential scientists of all time, Sir Isaac Newton. He built a very sophisticated model of the solar system to help him understand his studies and so on, of cosmology. And one day a non-believing friend came in to visit him, and being very impressed by his working model, which he saw there of the solar system, he asked Newton, "Who's made that model?" To which Newton replied, "Nobody." And the other scientists began to argue with him, demonstrate with him, saying, "Don't be so ridiculous. How could nobody, how could such an intricate model not be made by someone?" To which Newton apparently simply replied, "Exactly." You see, if you have no problem realizing that this little model needs a creator, then why is it such a problem to believe in a creator when you're confronted with the actual universe? With all its complexity, its beauty, and its grandeur, and its unexplained questions. So as Christians, we would say, no, we're not alone. Even the scientific facts point towards the reality of a supreme creator God, and rather than see the Bible and science as enemies, it's perfectly right and proper to see them as complementing each other. Which brings us finally to the truth of the Bible. How does it all fit together? Well, as I say, we're not going to look in great detail of it. There's many resources out there, but just some big principles. Christians believe truth is revealed in two ways: through God's word and through God's works. in creation, whether that's the macro creation that we see around us and are so overwhelmed by, or the micro creation which we look inside the working of the cell, or ourselves, as we look inside ourselves and see humanity and our consciousness and so on. God reveals himself through his word and his works. In the physical world, the material world, God's word gives us part of that picture. There are some explanations. And science gives us another part of that picture. So, for instance, the Bible says God created the heavens. But the Bible doesn't say specifically how the galaxies were created, how they were formed. But science does tell us something about the galaxies and their formation. And so as much as that is true, then we can and we should learn from it. There are two systems of truth, both superintended by God. And so the psalm that Ola read, Psalm 8, it makes two very fundamental, important points about our created world, doesn't it? First of all, it says that in its grandeur and its beauty, the world, the heavens, declare the glory of God. So there is evidence, the moon and the stars which you have made, there's evidence for a great creator God, a wonderful designer for the created universe. And then secondly, and importantly, the psalm says that the creation of mankind, men and women, humanity, is the crowning glory of that created world. We do have a unique and a specific position in the world. You've made him, or mankind, a little lower than the angels. You've crowned them with glory and honor. You've put all things under their feet. Mankind is the ruler, the steward of all of God's creation. That's why we're here. We do have purpose and significance. Now, neither of those assertions that the heavens declare the glory of God and that man is the crown of God's creation and ruling the creation, neither of those assertions are contradicted by the results of scientific inquiry. But what we need to remember is that science and the Bible have different agendas. They're there for different purposes. And one of the reasons for the apparent conflict sometimes between science and faith is that we've forgotten that science and theology or faith have different approaches. What do I mean? Well, science is, as we've seen, limited. It's limited to describing the physical, material, space-time world of matter and energy. It can do no more than understand how those things work. That's what science is trying to do. Ultimately, it can make no comment about the why. Why these things are here. The Bible claims and does comment on the why. The Bible is not concerned, I would say, primarily about mechanisms. It's more concerned about meanings. That's the agenda of the Bible. But these things are not at odds with each other. They're not conflicting. They are complementary. They're different levels of talking about reality. As creator and sustainer of the universe, God stands behind all that we see around us and all that science discovers. The laws of physics, cosmology, biology, chemistry, they're all his laws. Science has its ideas and its theories then about life and why we're here and how it came into existence, but it cannot answer some of the most fundamental questions of life. Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? What's the purpose and the meaning of it all? These are the kind of questions that the Bible is primarily interested in. And a book like Genesis, which means, of course, beginnings, introduces us to those answers. But we will miss the point of even the early chapters of Genesis if we come to them with a very strong scientific agenda rather than a theological agenda. The Bible's main purpose is to reveal God to us and to show us how to respond to him, not to satisfy the details of our scientific curiosity. It wasn't written as a science textbook, and we shouldn't treat it as one. The questions we can and should ask are about the bigger issues. What is the nature of the world around us? What does it mean to be human? What are my responsibilities in this world? What's gone wrong with our world? How can I know this God then? The truth of science is limited. If you wanted to generalize, I suppose you could say it seeks to answer the question how, but cannot answer the question why. The why question is what the truth of the Bible is primarily concerned with. And so, I suppose we can say Christians disagree. They can disagree over the how question, over the scientific data. They do. And we have to accept that disagreement. Some Christians see, for example, Genesis 1 and 2 as very literal, as literal accounts of creation that take literally 6 24-hour days as we now know them today, and that God created everything within that time frame. Other Christians, equally respectful of the authority of the Bible, would disagree with that necessarily. They would say, well, maybe it's a different type of literature. They would see the description of the days of creation as figurative, as metaphorical. But nevertheless, they outline a process of creation which could well have taken thousands of years, and which actually the scientific record would generally agree with. But even that process is begun and overseen by a creator God. The mechanism is not the important point. The meaning is the crucial thing. And the meaning of the creation story in the book of Genesis and other creation passages in the Bible, the meaning is to teach us that this world is not the result of blind chance, with no purpose, with no meaning, with no hope. It is the result of the action of a majestic creator whose glory and power is still reflected in the universe that he has made. Even though it is fallen and spoilt, his glory is still to be seen there. And as we've been singing this morning, we can worship him for that. But to know him fully, to know him properly, we need a further revelation in the revelation of his glory in nature. Though he does reveal himself in his creation, we need the revelation of the eternal Word, the eternal Son of God in the human flesh, God assuming the very nature of mankind, which he himself created. So that in that nature, mankind, humanity, he could identify with us, teach us, example for us, and above all rescue us from the mess that we've now made of the world that God originally made good, and that he has given us, as Psalm 8 tells us, to look after. That's our unique position. So has science disproved the Bible? Has science disproved the existence of God? No, of course not. That's why you have many Christian scientists still today. In fact, as Christians, we would say that the facts of science lead us to conclude that there is a creator God, there is a designer who is the author of life, not the other way. And as Christians, we would say that to go the other way, to conclude from the facts of science that there is no God, it leaves you with a world which is, well, it doesn't make any sense of existence at all. A world where there's no basis for hope. There's no purpose. There's no significance. There's no right or wrong, actually. There's no morality. If all we are is a result of the blind forces of chance, then we live in a world where you and I have no more ultimate significance than a pebble on the beach. We have no more purpose or significance than that. No, we know God through his world, but we need to know him through his word and through his word made flesh, through Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. And as we come to know him in that way, then there's no conflict necessarily between the creation that he's made and the revelation that we have of him in Jesus Christ. But we do need that further revelation. And so that's why in Psalm 19 we're told that not only is God's glory revealed in the world, but it's also revealed in his word, the law of the law. And we know from the New Testament that that word is finally revealed in all its fullness in Jesus. And in him we can put our trust. Because in Jesus, as we've seen in these tough questions, there is evidence. There is historical evidence that can be investigated and whose claims can be assessed and who we would believe by honest research and prayer. The Holy Spirit can reveal to us the truth about our purpose here in the universe and about our hope for the future. So, tough questions, but not necessarily conflict. And as I say, there's so much more out there that you can refer to. We'll put some of these things on the website, and I hope that those of you who are involved in scientific research and so on are assured in your faith that there's no need to be embarrassed to be a scientist and a Christian, and that we can, as Christians, give glory to God because of his wonder in creation, his amazement in the way that he's made us, and the wonder of his grace in Jesus Christ, who makes sense of an otherwise senseless existence. Well, we're going to continue to worship him now as we close in song.